All right, so let's jump right in. What is law? I mean, it sounds like a pretty simple question, right? It's the stuff we see in courtrooms, the rules the government makes, the things we follow every single day. But, and this is the really cool part, the deeper you dig into that one simple question, the more you realize. The answer, well, it changes absolutely everything. So is it really just a collection of rules that police and judges enforce? Or is there something deeper going on? Something that gets into big ideas like morality, power, and justice. We're going to see that how you answer that question pretty much defines the kind of society you live in. Okay, think about it like this, like a board game. Let's say you're playing Cluedo, right? If you and your friends get into an argument about a rule, what do? You just grab the rule book. Simple, problem solved. But when it comes to the laws of a whole society, yeah, it's not nearly that easy. Because with any rule book, you have to ask a much bigger question. Where do these rules get their power? I mean, where does that authority actually come from? In a game, it's easy. We all just agree to follow the rules. But for an entire country, why do we follow those rules? And that simple question, believe it or not, kicks off one of the oldest and most important debates in all of legal philosophy. So this debate basically breaks down into two major camps. First up, you've got something called natural law. The idea here is that for a law to be legit, it has to line up with some kind of higher moral code. Reason, ethics, maybe even a divine plan. The classic saying is, an unjust law is no law at all. But then, on the complete other side, you have legal positivism. And this view says, nope, a law's validity has absolutely nothing to do with whether it's moral. A law is a law simply because a recognized human authority, like a government, says it is. End of story. Okay, let's make this a little more concrete. Take a key thinker in natural law, Thomas Aquinas. He was convinced that if we just use our human reason, we can figure out these universal truths he called primary precepts. Things like, preserving human life or living together peacefully in a society. For Aquinas, these weren't just nice suggestions. They were the absolute non-negotiable foundation that all just human laws had to be built on. Okay, but let's say we lean towards the positivist side for a second. That, yeah, humans make the law. Well, that immediately opens up a whole new can of worms. Which humans get to make the rules? And more importantly, are there any limits to their power? For centuries, the answer to that question was a single powerful word: sovereignty. And what that meant was that a state had absolute authority inside its own borders. No outside interference. Whatever a country did at home was its own business, full stop. But over the last century or so, that ironclad idea has really started to show some cracks. And you can actually watch this shift happen over time. For almost 300 years, this idea of don't meddle in my business and I won't meddle in yours, the Westphalian system, that was the rule. But then the absolute horrors of World War II just shattered that consensus. The creation of the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights brought in this totally radical new idea that maybe, just maybe, some things, like basic human rights, are more important than national borders. And all of this thinking eventually led to a really powerful new doctrine in 2005. And that idea is the responsibility to protect, or R2P for short. And this completely flips the old idea of sovereignty on its head. It says sovereignty isn't a right for rulers to do whatever they want. It's a responsibility to their own people. And R2P argues that if a state fails, if it commits atrocities like genocide or war crimes, then the international community doesn't just have a right to intervene. It has a responsibility to step in. All right, so we've poked at where the law comes from, and we've talked about the limits of its power. But that still leaves one of the biggest, most fundamental assumptions of all, that the law is somehow a neutral referee applying the rules fairly to everyone. But is it? Is the law really blind? This is exactly the kind of question that critical legal theories dig into. Thinkers in this area, like in feminist jurisprudence or critical race theory, they argue that we can't just take the law at face value. They tell us to look under the hood and ask, who wrote these laws? Whose interests are they really serving? And what if, and this is the big one, what if the law isn't a neutral tool for justice at all, but is actually designed to keep existing power structures exactly where they are? So here's a really fascinating concept from critical race theory. It's called interest convergence. The basic idea is that progress for minority groups often only happens when that progress also benefits the dominant group. A classic example is the U.S. civil rights movement. A huge motivator for new legislation wasn't just a moral awakening, it was the Cold War. The American government realized that headlines about segregation were making the U.S. look bad on the world stage. So the change was driven just as much by geopolitical self-interest as it was by a quest for justice. And this gets to a really profound point made by the scholar Patricia Williams, which is that your relationship with the law totally depends on where you're standing. You see, for people whose rights have always been pretty secure, it might feel sophisticated or progressive to critique the whole idea of rights. But, as she points out, for people who have had to fight tooth and nail for those exact same rights, they aren't just an abstract idea. They're a vital tool for survival. The law just isn't experienced the same way by everybody. Okay, this brings us to our final layer of this whole puzzle. So let's say we have a law. It's on the books, we've even agreed on where its authority comes from. But the words on a page don't just apply themselves. Someone has to decide what they actually mean out here in the real world. So how does that happen?
Well, the basic process is pretty straightforward, right? The legislature writes the law, the executive branch puts it into action, but the real drama, the real friction happens in that third step, the judiciary. This is where judges have to interpret what the law actually means. And folks, that is where the fireworks really begin.
And this is the heart of another massive debate in law. On the one hand, should judges be originalists, basically acting like historical detectives, trying to figure out the exact original meaning of the people who wrote the law, sometimes hundreds of years ago? Or, on the other hand, should they be proposivists, focusing more on the law's underlying goal or purpose and adapting it to fit the world we live in today? I mean, the approach a judge takes here can lead to completely different results on everything from free speech to privacy. So, after all that, we come back to our original question. What is law? And the real answer is, there's no single easy answer. It's not some static thing that we can define once and then just put in a box and forget about. This isn't just some dusty historical argument for philosophers. The question of whether law should reflect morality, the limits of state power, whether it's truly fair, how it should be interpreted, these debates are happening right now. They're happening in our courts and in our governments. It is a living, breathing conversation that is actively shaping the world we all live in every single day. And that really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. As our technology, our society, and our whole understanding of justice evolve faster than ever before, what is the law going to mean tomorrow? This whole conversation, it's not over. In a lot of ways, it's really just getting started.